You're listening to the Janchi Show, hosted by 3 Korean American adoptees diving headfirst into what it means to be adopted, Korean American, and more. And now, here's your hosts, Nathan, Patrick, and KJ.
안녕하세요, 여러분. Bienvenidos al Janchi Show. If you were not prepared for that amount of language coming at you, that's okay. This is a different, special Janchi Show episode where I, KJ, have the opportunity to be the guest of the show, and our friend Erik Kemp comes on and interviews me about the intersection of disability and adoption. For our new listeners, we are currently on break. But Janchi means to feast in Korean, and we believe that any proper feast means party, and so we're here to celebrate the intersectional identities that make us who we are. The show is typically hosted by myself, KJ, with Patrick and Nathan, 2 other Korean adoptees. But as we are on break, this is just kind of a unique, special time to do a bonus episode. So Erik approached me and was like, hey, I went to a conference or a session at Con, which is an adoptee network conference. And was like, yeah, so it just got me thinking, made me curious about kind of the intersection of disability and special diseases and adoptees. And so he reached out and said, like, would you want to have a conversation about that? And I was like, of course. And then I said, would you like to record an episode with me about it? So this is something that I've been really passionate about. And wanted to talk about, but never really knew how to. That being said, we probably get a lot of things wrong. We probably use language that maybe isn't the best, but honestly, it's more just an opportunity for us to explore and be curious and think about what it is to have this type of conversation. So open to hearing feedback on the episode where maybe our language could be more inclusive, could be safer, or things that you found really interesting. We'd love to hear your feedback. So that is all for this intro, and we're going to jump into the interview right now. This is something that I have wanted to talk about, and that's like an area that I don't have like the most experience or practice in talking about. So I thought that like having you, if you've got questions and you've got thoughts and like that might actually be able to be a good way to enter into this conversation.
Absolutely.
So I get to practice my language. You're safe to ask anything you want, because
oh my goodness, yeah.
I don't know what's you know. I know little more than you do, besides the fact that it's my life. You know.
Yeah.
But in terms of like good language and things, I don't know. So,
well, thank you for, I guess, just kind of the willingness to share your experiences and share your story. Because if I've learned anything, is that we're at the intersection of so many different communities, so many different identities, that like to understand them fully, it's kind of an impossible task. And sometimes I think people think it's a fool's errand, and so they give up on trying to understand that. More than anything, I think because of the adoptee lens and the adoptee perspective, it's so fascinating to hear like what intersection adoptee, like the adoptee narrative, like I guess permeates to the disability or rare diseases communities. And I also find it weird, or maybe not weird, I don't want to say that word. It's more like I find it interesting that those 2 spaces are grouped together. What are your thoughts on like, you know, on grouping or consolidating, you know, people who have rare diseases with people who have disabilities?
I mean, so strictly, I guess, for rare disease and disability, like as I think about it, and this is, so my wife is the marketing manager for Make-A-Wish North Texas. So obviously like her job deals with children with rare diseases or children with like critical illnesses and things like that. And so I think like, as I think through my own experience and what I've seen and read from others in the disability space, as well as like just kind of hearsay through my wife's work and thinking about and imagining like, what does life look like? I think it's more just like I think there are probably similarities and significant differences. Similarities in that, like from a parent's perspective and from a secondary perspective, like if one has a disability or a rare disease, that like whether or not they were born with it or is contracted later in life, whatever, like it could, like the way it affects one's life might be tangibly similar. However, from the person with said disability or said rare disease, like the mental space could be really different. And I think that that's where, like we talk about so often in the adoptee space, how it's like, typically the story of adoption is told from a parent's perspective and not from the adoptee's perspective. And I think that like that grouping makes sense from a parent's perspective or from a guardian's perspective or from a friend's like outside perspective. Right. But if we were to flip the narrative, I wonder if people with disabilities or with rare diseases would continue to choose to group them together, or if we would see the same type of aggregation issues that we see with like the term Asian American.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Cause I was thinking that too, is like, are we acting on a monolithic structure of, once again, speaking on behalf of, because there's these, I don't want to say marginalized groups, but these groups very specific unto their own, that even though there is some crossover, it's like, is there enough crossover to validate and quantify and qualify for a grouped space, a larger, like you said, aggregate of that. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that. And I think it's much like the adoptee space where we're still trying to define what that may look like. I think there's definitely basis and agency for having individual groups that are, or communities and events and what have you, that are specifically tailored towards, a certain, disability or critical disease. But yeah, being able to kind of, I guess, like investigate those in one space, in one event or a session or what have you. I think there's some merit in that, but I don't know, mostly because it opened up my eyes. I think that's, maybe I'm burning the lead here, is that, going to con and seeing this event that was, or session that was specifically talking about rare diseases and disabilities opened my worldview, and I want to know more. Some facts they gave me, or they gave us, those that attended, the opportunity to look at their presentation again, and some facts and stats here. And KJ, I would love to hear kind of your reaction to these, or if they're different from what you've seen. Is internationally adopted children have disability rates similar to those adopted domestically, 11.7% versus 12.2% respectively, and more than twice the rate for all children in that age range, 5.8%. As far as the adoptee lens goes, this kind of blew my mind too. 39% of adopted children have special healthcare needs, and 26% have moderate to severe health difficulties, as compared to 19% and 10% in the general population. I guess kind of going back onto the adoptee narrative, how do some of these statistics, do they shock you or do they not shock you? Or are they the type of statistics that are reinforcing a particular narrative? Or, once again, stats are depending on, how you use them, can certainly reinforce certain things. So KJ, I guess, some certain thoughts on those numbers that I just kind of read off.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So my disability has always played a big part in my internal narrative of why I was adopted, or I guess specifically why I was given up for adoption. So when I don't know if it was when I went back to Korea or if it was like in leading up to or following that trip, but it was around that trip that I got to read my paperwork from the US side of Holt International. And I don't know if they're any different over in Korea necessarily, but got to read those papers, and it said that I had a sibling, and I was like, well, that, like, I don't know if there's like a large age difference, kind of like with Nathan, or if they're, maybe have like a bunch of siblings. But to me, I always, I guess, had the sense that they probably just gave me up because I was born with a finger missing, and some further complications of my hand. And so like maybe they just weren't in a place financially to deal with that. granted, these are thoughts I've had since I was a kid, with no understanding of any national healthcare system, let alone America's or Korea's, respectively. So I just figure, I don't know, like surgeries cost money and stuff. And so that's probably why they gave me up, because they couldn't afford to do that. So to me, it makes sense, just like drawing that out, that a reason for parents giving their children up for adoption broadly internationally is, the hope for a better life, and to hopefully find some parent who can provide what they cannot. And I mean, that's maybe like the most hopeful, optimistic take. There's also a take where it's just like, well, I don't want to deal with this kid, and so, give them up, whatever. But either way, I think that there is some version of, we hope that this is for a better life. On the flip side, I think there's also like, not having gone through the adoption experience as an adopter, I don't know, but I'm sure there's just like an extra willingness for some parents to say like, well, I don't get a say in whether or not my kid is born with special needs or a rare disease or whatever. So I'll just go ahead and check these boxes. Or I do know some friends who have adopted domestically, and it's like, yeah, it feels weird to like say yes to this, but then no to this. Like, I don't, so, but I think broadly it does fit into my perception of hope for a better life on one hand, probably some version of saviorism on the other.
Yeah.
And also I think the combination of those things is not overall like a terrible thing. Like if you have a child who has a disability or is born with a disease or anything like those kind of things, and the family feels like they can't, keeping them in the family would significantly detract from their life, then who am I to say that as a parent, like, of course you just want the best for your kid, and they decided that was going to be the best for their kid, right? So I think that like, just I don't know statistically, but like in my mind, again, it would make sense that would be a common reason for adoptees to be given up, would be just because of that. Like, we hope that they get a better life. I know that there's a lot of takes on like whether or not, like how we define a better life and all those kinds of things. But I think purely from the parents' perspective in that instance, they're just like, I don't know, hope for the best here. Cause I just don't feel equipped to do that. And realistically, if they're in that headspace, they probably don't also have access to the research or the knowledge or whatever of adoptees who are adults with disabilities or with rare diseases and things, like being able to then speak out. It's like, well, actually, this is what turned out for me, 30 years on. Here's some extra perspective to make this super difficult for you, parent.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's just like, it's just one of those things. But I think that does, at least in my internal narrative, that would explain that higher prevalence of special needs adoptees being out there in the world compared to the general populace.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And speaking on kind of your own experiences and also giving grace, I think, to those of the adopters, which is, incredibly tough to do when with everything considered, right? But yeah, it's a matter of resources, it's a matter of education, it's a matter of knowing what the, I guess, possibilities are, and when so much of it is either unwritten or not, or hasn't been really taken into exploration within formal educated, informal education and public spaces, it can be very kind of, once again, a something that's unknown. And for me, that's been that experience. And so thank you again for kind of sharing on that. And one other thing from the presentation that they mentioned was, and this kind of really hit me, was the disability is one of the few marginalized groups anyone can be a part of at any time in their lives. And that was, I don't know. That was, I didn't quite, I'm still kind of processing it, honestly.
Yeah.
I've had friends reach out where they would let me know about, whether it was a, disability of theirs, something that they've notice behavior within themselves or with me, or what have you. And they're saying like, have you gotten diagnosed, or have you explored that side of that behavior and find out motivations or what have you. And then for others, it's like kind of a clear physical disability or rare disease that they've gotten diagnosed, they've gotten information, but depending on what it was, what the disability or rare disease is, they may have tons of information. They may have very limited ones. And I think that, once again, kind of through the adoptee lens, adds another layer, or at least a salient one, to like, I know we don't like using this term, but a fog of like an ambiguous realm in which we aren't able to define, like to further define our experiences. And I think with more language, with more research, with more education, and more people just in our communities growing up and speaking out, we're able to further define these things. Have you, I guess my next question would be like, have you been able to explore those spaces, specifically within like adoptee communities and that intersection of disability and adoption?
I've not, and I'm actually more surprised that the disability doesn't come up more often on the show, because like the stats that you provided, and just my own kind of sense of like, there gotta be more of us, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just like it's so prevalent. And so I've explored like disability and adoption separately. So my surgeries were provided through a hospital here in Dallas called Scottish Rite Hospital. And they had lots of summer camps and things for probably all of their patients. But like the ones that I went to were specifically like hand camps for all their hand patients.
Okay.
And so I got to go to a number of those growing up. And then again, as I just went to one as a teen. And so like, it was interesting, like just being in that space, but it was all with like people with disabilities in their hands. And so like finding like a really niche group among already like a small group. But no, I've not explored the intersection of disability really with any of my identities, which I think is it's the one that I've felt most clearly for the longest, if that makes sense. Like, because I was born this way. I'm just like, I've always been in the disability space. But I think my parents, in the same way that they raised me to be colorblind, they also raised me to believe that I could do anything. They just had to I just had to be clever to figure out, like, if I want to play guitar, like, okay, well, like we'll resource you to find a teacher that works with you, or just be clever about the way that you do it. Right. And so they were always empowering and uplifting me to make things happen for myself, which is, I'm really grateful for. But at the same time that I had my like adoption apocalypse and like was wrestling with the implications of that new revelation, I started really considering myself as disabled and what that meant, and like moving through all of the things that, like, again, for example, for guitar, like there are just techniques, sounds, playing styles, like whole songs that I will just never be able to play because my hand is the way it is. And I was just like moving through the sadness of that reality, not being angry necessarily, but just like in my own like level of like acceptance and grief and that, and then a little bit later I found a couple of Instagram accounts, and especially Disability Together on Instagram was one that really pushed me to think around like the intersection of, for example, being like an environmentalist and being anti-ableist, I guess. You know what I mean? So like, but like thinking about disability and what the disabled community needs. Like one great example was like, the disabled community really benefits from single-use plastics. So even though like environmentalists are like, single-use plastics are really terrible. And you're like, can we figure out a solution that like saves the world and also continues to look after the disabled community, you know? And I was like, oh man, that was like the first thing that really got my mind swirling on what other things are the general public being like told, thinking about like what are the other big activisms that may inadvertently be not thinking about the disabled community and other levels of intersectionality. I think as we talk about like what does adoptee activism look like, what does Asian American activism look like in solidarity with other marginalized groups, I'm like still working out how to figure out how disability plays into the way that I talk about adoption, the way that I talk about Asian Americanness, the way that I talk about social justice, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So, and that's why I wanted to do this show like this, because I was like, I don't know what the entry point is, but this is a good starting point because you get to ask me all the questions and I get to try putting my thoughts into cohesive statements out loud.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's an exercise for both of us. And I'm glad that you kind of mentioned that kind of meta reasoning because, people, I think, and this is, I also think this is almost ableist thinking, is that like, I have so many questions, but I also don't want to offend or like trigger or, be ableist, right? I want to make sure that like, as I ask questions, it's a very safe environment and a respectful one. And if people don't want to share, that's fine. It's just more like, I think I went to one session, then all of a sudden my curiosity just became absolutely piqued because it's a worldview and an experience of an adoptee, but like with such a vastly different perspective that I'm completely intrigued by. And it's not like as a, like it's like not a kink or a fetish. It's just more like, I need to know more about this because it's just new territory. And I think a lot of people who don't have a rare disease or a disability, they feel like, where is that space to ask questions? So, I mean, same to you. It's like, it's wonderful to kind of to speak with you in that regard and ask questions freely.
Well, let me just say too, like on the thing of asking questions, because I found that I run into this a lot, especially in the interviews that we have on the show with people who also have live rent free at the intersection of queer identity, in term whether that's gender or sexuality or something else. Like, I'm like, can I ask questions about this? Should I ask questions about it? And for me, like the extra like hesitation is like, we're on a show about adoption. And so like, I kind of in the same way, I'm like, I had just like a long time ago needed to work through some of my own hangups around queer identity. And so like, just part of that for me was just becoming curious. And I was like, I don't know if this show, because they came on to talk about adoption, is not necessarily the place to talk about the queerness, even though that is obviously an important intersection, right? But I think the thing with asking questions and not wanting to offend is like, A, you have to have some relationship, or B, just always be willing to not get the answer that you want. Always be willing to give the person that you're asking the question like an out, be like, if you don't want to answer this right now, totally get it, whatever, like just like to do like we talk about emotional burden and like the emotional like lifting of like lots of things from marginalized communities, like I don't want to like some of the things that I see online is like, there's a lot of people, there are already resources out there for you to learn. Don't give your friend emotional labor to do all that, so like, Absolutely. If you can ask the question and also like do all the emotional labor of like giving them an easy out, giving them like the space to just say like, I don't want to talk about this, giving them like whatever that is, then I feel like you're already 80% of the way there in terms of creating a safe space to ask questions. And then just be like, any answer that you give is great. Even if it's just like, no. And you're like, it wasn't even a yes or no question. And you did that for me. Like you said, like, I went to con. Would you be interested in talking about this? And I was like, yeah, let's do this as a podcast.
Great.
So like, I'm happy to talk about this offline, but also I think that this is something that I do want to explore, and I want to explore out loud because as you know, the show is all about making safe spaces. So, yeah.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, KJ, I once again, thank you for giving agency and allowance there and understanding, because I think, there's too many times where, and I'm glad that you actually brought up the queer community too, because like there's so many questions that, once again, you don't want to give them the emotional burden, right? But also too, it's like, how can I frame this correctly? Because I feel very ignorant right now, kind of thing. And so I was even thinking about the term and kind of moving forward is that I was kind of even thinking the term of how I use like that's lame to describe something. And then I learned that lame was also like a way of saying like, oh, that's a lame duck or like something that's disabled. And it was, that's what it used to mean. And I get that like words can change and definitions can change with them, but it's also, I didn't know if that is something triggering or if there's language out there to say something else, or like what like people thoughts are especially in, disabled communities, like what are some of those words, or like what are some things that we are trying to advocate for in contemporary times.
Yeah, so it's funny that you bring up lame, because I've literally never thought about that, even though like in my my early life Bible times, like it's so common that you hear like the lame will walk, like that's just very common vernacular. And so you're like, oh yeah, like, but then I've never tied that to like something like, oh, it's so lame, just being like that those are connected, like that their roots come from the same place, or especially a lame duck. So like personally, that's not triggering for me because like I have always associated lame with the inability to walk, or to quote walk properly. And so like lame duck, I was like, I guess flying is the main mode of transportation for a duck. So if it can't fly, then it could be a lame, whatever. But like, because my motor functions, my like primary physical motor functions that enable me to travel aren't hindered by my disability, then I've not ever personally had a problem with that. But I think there's I don't know, this is kind of a cop-out answer. And I think there are so many people who would get angry at me, but again, I'm a newbie in this space as well. Sure. Like my hunch is that there is probably not a good way to say anything negative about anything without it being rooted in some type of bias or prejudice, like racism, like any of those things, you know what I mean? Which begs the question, like, well, how do you say that like something sucks? And like, well, I mean, I don't know, like just say that a thing sucks.
I don't like this right now. I don't know,
but like also like I feel like especially in the case of like that's so lame, is like while you could say that about a situation or a circumstance, in my own experience, I typically hear that about like literally a person's inability to do something, like, oh, I can't go to the party Friday night because I was grounded, or whatever, like, oh, that's so lame. Yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it literally refers to a person's inability to do something. There's probably other ways to say that, but there's also just ways that you could like, instead of like bemoaning your situation by casting like, and this is really nitpicky, but this is also the type of conversation and like the way that I think about the world. And so it's like, it's really nerdy for me and fun for me. But like, instead of bemoaning the situation by placing blame on a person's inability to do something, you could also express sympathy for their inability to do something and be like, and like in that way, like uplift the person and be like, oh man, it sucks. Like, we're going to miss you. Like that's a total bummer. You know what I mean? And then you're like, you express the same kind of thing, just in a way that doesn't punch down, in a way that doesn't like imply some level of guilt or ableism or, any of those kinds of things. And I think like, that's a really, like in our recent show, we just talked about like the power of switching from but to and language. So like, whatever that is, because of like the way that but negates the previous clause. Like if you switch to and, it actually adds to the previous clause. And so then we hold more space for gray areas, right? So this is, in this situation, saying that's so lame is like really hyper nitpicky and can be like a very simple way to like reframe the way that you think about a situation and be like, well, how can I express sympathy for what's happening and like continue to build on a relationship that I have, even though like some people will be like, oh, it's just like, just messing around with this person, like whatever, just giving them stick or whatever. And you're like, yeah, but even still, you can do that and still like improve the relationship without having to punch down. So all that being said, I'm not the person to talk to about like the group language that might be hurtful or harmful, because that's like a clear blind spot for me. There's even debate and I have no idea what the general temperature of this is, but like, do disabled people call themselves disabled? Do they call themselves people with disabilities?
Yeah.
Like how, like, and that changes from, I think, generally from person to person about like how, whether they choose to identify as disabled or as a person with a disability or, you know, any of that type of stuff. So I think that language is really difficult, is always worth considering and like complexifying. But for me, that's just a huge blind spot.
Yeah, because I think growing up and figuring out like, do I call them handicapped, or are they handicapable, or are they abled, or like, you know, what is it? Like, I mean, can't we just go by each other's names? And that's kind of like the more cop out, like optimistic of like, we're all human beings kind of thing. And in many spaces that can work, but I think it also kind of, like I said, or like you said, it was the but language versus the and language, where it's like, yeah, we're all human, but there's this, or no, we're all human and there's these, you know, certain things that further define our experience of the human condition and of, you know, human experiences. So I think that's very interesting. Yeah. And thank you for bringing up like, kind of like do we call like, I'm not in the space, so I won't use we language, but it's like, yeah, do disabled people call themselves disabled people? Is that how they want to be called? And that's where I think you mentioned the queer community, like where, you know, you are, or people taking agency over their pronouns. I think that's huge. So being able to kind of like signpost those type of things is massive, and to show people that like, I am an ally, but I'm also not like, oh my goodness, like well-versed or educated in these spaces. And so I think oftentimes we approach these things with trepidation and like timidness, like, I don't know what to do, so I think I'm just going to kind of avoid it my entire life. And with that, you're not really continuing conversation. You're just like kind of remaining in ignorance and hoping not to step on toes. And I don't think that's a great approach. And that's an approach that I took for a long time. Something I wanted to speak about was like my niece. She's I'll say this, she's on the spectrum, and is I don't know if class has high functioning autism. It's more like she has certain triggers, and she has certain behaviors that are, you know, once again, I don't want to speak on behalf of her, but yeah, I think autism too is just one of those ones where there's so many different forms of it. It's like, how, like, do you feel comfortable like operating on the narrative of that, or like on the monolith of autism? But like you said, it's like, or do you feel like you have language to say like, no, this is my hand, or if it's only like, I guess, how would you describe your disability, and like, how would you identify yourself if you were trying to explain to somebody else what happened?
Yeah. So,
or who you are.
I typically, when I talk with my wife, because she has like some of these same hangups, and I only say that not to say that I don't have these same hangups, but like she and I just like talk about these things. I typically say like, if there's a politically correct term for a broad group of people, then use the politically correct term. But as soon as you can be more specific than that, be more specific than that. Like it's not like, I use queer because like, for me, in my mind, like queer encompasses gender, it encompasses sexuality, it encompasses like the freedom of questioning and the freedom of like figuring it out, basically. And if I know a man who is cisgendered and homosexual, then I'll be like, oh, that's a gay man, you know. Or if I know a woman who is not cisgendered and who is heterosexual, then like I'll be like, okay, this is how this person chooses to define themselves. Like I'll continue to be more specific where I can be, right? And so that's like broadly what I say. And so for me specifically, I call myself disabled. And I guess I don't like, again, this is another blind spot because it's not a space that I've been in for very long. I don't know the classifications of disability beyond like I have a physical disability in my right hand.
Yeah.
Like I'm missing a finger and I'm missing one of my forearm bones. And also my arm is just generally shorter than my left arm.
Okay.
So like that's like just physically what I have. 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds might just be like, he got something wrong with his hand. His hand looks different.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you nailed it. Like that's exactly what it is, you know? But like, yeah, so I'm just like, I don't know. Like I call myself disabled. I would say I have a physical disability. And like things like, especially I think the spectrum of, and this has really come out in my web development work, but the spectrum of like motor skills, the spectrum of like color visibility, what one is considered maybe like legally blind or legally deaf or any of those types of things is really like interesting for me as a web developer, because like I typically think like, oh, well, I just can't do things completely, you know, even though it's like, well, you could just like, you could still technically hear like low frequency vibrations, but like you're legally deaf or whatever, you know, all those kinds of things. So just like as a web developer, like I prefer all of my tools to be accessible by default, and will actively seek out those tools that are accessible by default.
Love that, yeah.
Just because it's like, I mean, it's important to have that stuff in there, especially now that I work for a government, and like that definitely has to be accessible by default, because I have no idea what the stats are for the Choctaw tribe in terms of like the disability community within that. But you know, just want that to be, it's the internet, like it should be accessible by default. So yeah, but I think the spectrum of that has really opened my eyes too, to be like, oh, actually I can be even more gracious, and I can do even more work to think about people who are quote unquote slightly disabled, you know, or those kinds of things. A classic example is being like somebody whose motor skills are affected and you can't see any physical manifestation of that. Like they don't have a walker, they're not in a wheelchair, they don't have braces on their legs, or they don't have like any like maybe they have a really good prosthetic on their hand or something like that, you know. That like actually there's like levels of disability. Like I consider myself to be like, quote, not that disabled. Because like generally my hand doesn't affect things until you get to like, for lack of a better term, like a 12th grade level or like a college, you know, like undergrad level, because it's like I can do most things and not have to worry about it, you know. Like I can tie my shoes, I can generally get paper towel out of a paper towel dispenser at a bathroom, I can open a bag of chips, you know, whatever. But it's just like that, thinking about that range and that spectrum of ability. That's like really been interesting for me.
Absolutely. And you mentioned web development, and I've been thinking a lot about accessibility. And how, especially being in, you know, trying to get into film and television and entertainment, where people are they still can't get over the subtitles of, you know, of films. And I'm just thinking like how much that actually helps people to understand your stories, and yet you don't want those there, or seem to have some hang up with, like, you know, reading a film or having the subtitles there for people to, because like I was thinking about like how with people going to the movie theaters, I love going to the movie theaters. I'm one of those that like, yes, I love the movie theater experience. And then, or even visiting a website, it's like, what are the accessibility, like, or what are things people are doing to make it more accessible for those that do have a disability, either visual or otherwise, or that is going to not just enhance their experience. Like one of the few things I like to do is like putting on the closed captioning, because it kind of gives me an insight as to how a film or television show was written, because they'll describe the sounds, they'll like talk about, you know, kind of the descriptions and what's happening, versus the, you know, like being in public spaces where people are like, why isn't just subtitles a default? Why aren't certain things just default there for people? So granted, that's a lot of policy, that's a lot of, you know, government sanctions. I'm sure that's a lot of, you know, industry standards, but I didn't know if you would be able to talk more about how, as a web developer, when thinking about what kind of accessibility and what kind of things you do for a website or what have you, or a software program to make sure that people can access the info just like anybody else, and what efforts are being made.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna like talk a ton about like the web development, just because like it's gonna get real nitty gritty, really quickly. But I think that I think that they're like one of the easiest things to consider. For example, like, and you talk about like the spectrum of ability, specifically for vision, is like, are your colors, do your colors have enough contrast? And I think about this all the time. Like, people talk about alt text on Instagram. And actually, one of my other favorite disability advocates, her name is Kelsey Lindell, Kelsey_Lindell on Instagram. So her latest post is literally threads, accessibility and disability inclusion, right? So like how ways you can support disabled people on the app that's breaking the internet. Like things like that. So like alt text, I think, is really important for people who are, like, just don't have access to that at all, like to visually see the internet, especially on a platform like Instagram. But I also think what's interesting is like, if people, like, as people move away from Instagram being purely photos and just like being like text on text or like image slides, whatever, like, do your colors have enough contrast? Like if you have a user who has trouble differentiating specifically colors, like blues and greens, like kind of fade into the same area or whatever. Like if your colors don't have enough contrast, then like you've done all this work in creating this beautiful slide and like, 3% of your audience can't read it. Yeah. And like, I mean, I guess they could have alt text, but again, talk about like the like ability on a spectrum, like this user may not have like a screen reader, may not like know how to look for alt text because like they typically don't need to go that far in their day-to-day life, but they can't read your slides because there's not enough contrast in your images. So they're like, I guess I'll just like pay attention to, whatever. But like if your feed is mostly slides, then that's really important too, So I think that like color and contrast are one of those things that are like so important, specifically on the internet. And I also wonder too, like when you were talking about movies, I'm like, oh yeah, subtitles would be great. I have grown up with subtitles because I'm half deaf. I guess that's technically another, like, again, level of ability that I don't consider myself disabled by. Like, I'm a professional audio engineer, hilariously, but like I am like half deaf. So like I can like mostly hear, or I can hear enough out of my right ear, but it's not like full throttle, right? So like if somebody yell at me across the street, I'm like, I have no idea where to look because like I don't have that sense of space. So I've just always had subtitles on, so they've never bothered me. And I wonder, what would our movie theaters look like if they like came ready-made with captions? Like, think about like the magic of back when we used to have actual midnight premieres before they started being like the day before at like 2 p.m., whatever. Like just capturing like the energy and the excitement of a crowd at a movie premiere, like that's locked off to a whole community of people because like they can't go and see captions. And there's so much more to movie experience than just its sound. There's so much more to like specifically like going to the movies, like there's the whole social component. There's just like the whole experience. Right. And so like, because of one thing, we've essentially trained a group of people to potentially just ignore the theaters because they can't access the main bit, but they also don't get then the extra 20% that makes going to a movie special, and if like, whether that's like we recompose the screens to have subtitles ready to go on the bottom, or like do DPs and directors, like, can they compose their images and their shots, like thinking about this is going to get subtitles. How can I compose this in a way that like I can still have a beautiful shot and it's not going to get in the way of subtitles being overlaid on top of that?
Absolutely.
Or is there like a clever way that we can do that? And finally, my last consideration with subtitles is we just watched Trevor Noah's latest stand-up on Netflix, and I was like, the subtitles are good and I appreciate them, but also I wish that like the people doing the subtitles timed it up so that like the jokes and the timing, like all of that still landed. Because like half the time Sarah will laugh at a joke because like she's already read the punchline, but I'm like, but the delivery and the all, like all of that. And maybe that's like, maybe because like you want to like read all the information and then watch the delivery separately, that isn't exactly like, that's not a 1-for-1 translation. But I'm like, isn't there a way that like we can make subtitles better. Like I know that people are freaking out about like the Stranger Things subtitles because like they were so descriptive in their sounds. And I was like, again, if you have some hearing, but you like don't have full hearing, then like that type of description is really wonderful. And I think is really engaging in the lack of like the hearing impaired space.
Sure.
At the same time, like Firefly Lane, like a regular subtitle is just sucks teeth. Like, they're like, if I don't know what that sound is, they suck their teeth a lot. Like, what even is that? You know, just like all sorts of things. So I think that there's still so much room to go in terms of that. But it just makes me like, there's so much extra room for like, for me, I see the gap as just like so much space for creativity and fun and playfulness. And it just like improves the experience for everyone, you know?
You bring up a great point about like how directors or filmmakers, right, in general, it's like, how can we, you know, if we know that it's going to get the subtitle treatment, or if you know, like even in just different languages, like, you know, where that's going to be. I always thought too, it'd be super helpful to have subtitles. And you see a little bit of this in different shows where they'll put the subtitles right underneath the character speaking, because there's times where I'm like, they have somebody off camera speaking and I'm like, well, who off camera? There's like 5 people in this room. Who off camera is speaking? And so even just putting like a name and a colon there would be super helpful to do certain things like that. Aesthetically, it's a lot more pleasing to look and read at a back and forth exchange. I'm not quite sure if I would consider myself disabled in the sense that I perforated both eardrums, or had perforations. So I have some loss of hearing.
I was like, how did you self-perforate your eardrums?
Playing rugby.
They're ready to tear.
Yeah, I just kind of, you know, pull them out, you know. And
yeah.
But no, playing rugby, I tackled somebody and then a rush of air pushed into my left ear. And I felt I could hear the ocean for, like 3 days. It didn't clear up for that long. And then the other one, I jackknifed into a pool off of a diving board and clapped my ear right up against the water like an idiot.
Oh yeah.
And then so I thought it was just full of water, and it's like, no, Eric, that's not full of water. You punctured a hole in your eardrum, you idiot.
You done damage.
Yeah. So there's certain things. Yeah, I mean, I still suffer from tinnitus and certain other things, but to your point, like, you know, from the listening community and like even as a writer myself, I'm trying to think about like, okay, so how are they writing this out? And so the closed captioning, or even the screen readers, the description, those things are actually super helpful, because then I get to learn like, oh, okay, so they're trying to elicit motion with like what you're saying, like the teeth chattering in the background. It's like, you know, like, and for those that can't hear at all, like those are very important cues and very important motifs to the story. And being able to have those sonic cues to experience that story even more so. And so like just kind of reeling back into the kind of the adoptee community, it's like being able to understand those kind of nuances and accessibility. It's like, what can the adoptee community to have these spaces be more accessible for those that are disabled or experiencing a rare disease?
I mean, I don't know that there's anything more specific that the adoptee community can do in terms of making things accessible, beyond like what every community needs to do.
Yeah, ADA stuff.
Yeah, but I also wonder like what the conversation looks like for. I think again, like going back to early days, our conversation is not that long, but to the top of our conversation, of, you know, what does it look like to center the adoptee perspective? When you talk about, so this is something that I wrestle with a lot, and why I really struggle with people who come out strongly against international adoption, or adoption in general, is, and I'm not saying that they're wrong or invalid or any of those things. Just one of my own personal hangups is like, like one of my good friends, he's gay. So if he wants kids, like adoption would be a viable route for him. Yeah. So it's like, I understand like adoption reform feels nearly impossible. I understand that there are lots of issues with the way adoption happens currently, broadly, internationally, domestically, et cetera. And how can I like push for change and also not rob of a loved one of his ability to have a child and to have a family. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like the same kind of thing is like, what does a disabled adoptee discussion that's led by disabled adoptees look like in terms of broadly how we think about adoption reform, how we think about like the parents who give up their kids for adoption, the parents who are receiving disabled or kids with rare diseases. I don't know. Do we still say special needs? I don't know. But like
that's another thing I don't know.
Special needs adoptees, probably not, but that's what I grew up with.
Sure.
So for the purpose of shorthanding it within this discussion only, yeah. So it's just like, but how do we have like those adoptees be the ones to lead other types of, you know what I mean? Because I think it's so easy to fall into the trap of like, this is my experience. It's been validated, revalidated, spoken to, amend, whatever, by others in my community. And I am a healthy, able-bodied adoptee. Yeah. So what does it look like then for a disabled adoptee to be like, well, actually, like, this is my situation. And, you know, like hearing it played out against like all three parties of the adoption triangle. What does that look like? And how do we continue to push for better reform, better adoption, basically, if not adoption abolition, while also not leaving out this section of adoptees?
Absolutely. You bring up a great point, is that I myself and a strange advocate for less intercountry adoption, less transracial adoption, because it just, I know from personal experiences, and then, you know, just talking with others within the community, like it just creates a bevy of trauma yeah. And maybe it's also due to the times that we're given it, but like, I mean, that's completely outside of anybody's control. But like I say this with a lot of adoptees, it's a strange notion to be in a community where we don't want to see future generations of it. And like, to your point, is that, you know, it's not like a manifestation of wanting a child. It's like, you know, providing a home and a family. And it's not so much saviorism. It's more like, you know, because of who I am as a person, right, I am unable to have a child. And for a lot of people, it was like that. And those were the kind of the circumstances and motivators of many parents, I think, out there. And so what you mentioned, the adoptee triangle, it's like, yeah, that one of those parties, right, that was their motivation. They weren't equipped, or they were unaware of so many other resources. And I try to give them grace, but then, you know, now it's like, well, how can we start taking the charge and the lead, and where does it all go from here? And I think that's where the direction, sometimes I feel like we're screaming into a void, or we're screaming back at we're preaching to the choir, but we have no direction as to where this is going. And that's why I've kind of been trying to have others speak up and know what, and be a little just more feel. And once again, it's a kind of a selfish thing. I want to feel more educated. I want to know more. And, you know, it would be great to not speak on others' behalf, but just be more knowledgeable about, hey, when you say like I've met many adoptees where they're just like, down with the system, no more adoption, none of that. And to your point, it's like, not taking away from that. You've clearly had some life experiences where it would be in full support of that. Seriously, be full in support of that. And it goes back to the but language and the and language. It's like, and there are other adoptees, right, that have experienced certain other things with their adoption where, like, would they feel the same way? And so it's like, yeah, we share that part of our identity with each other, but what are other circumstances and other factors, and how are they playing into all of this? And I think that's where the diaspora of adoptees in general, whether it's transracial, intercountry, domestic, foster care, late discovery. Like it keeps going. It just keeps going.
Yeah.
And I think because I'm so interested in the adoption side of all of it, is that because adoption kind of permeates and is a part of every single one of those, that it's like, okay, well, what is that kind of, and maybe we'll never find it, but what is kind of that shared commonality that adoption maybe more than the others, why does that permeate more than some of the other parts of our identity? I don't know. I still don't know. And I love exploring those types of spaces. I don't know if you have approaches to kind of like figure out like, or step into other communities and other kind of, I guess, things that are strongly tied to your identity, and like how to, I guess, navigate the intersections of all of those things. And maybe what your personal thoughts on how adoption might be the binding factor amongst all of these communities.
I think it's interesting. It's hard to talk about like our identities. One of the things that I realized about myself early on in starting the show was I was experiencing my the best way to say this is the aftermath of my adoption apocalypse, like this revelation of like, oh shit, I'm adopted, like I'm Asian, like whatever. Like the aftermath of that took me on a certain trajectory where I felt like I needed to lean into my Asian Americanness. And I needed to lean into my like social justice-ness, my anti-racism. Well, I needed to get to level 1 in terms of anti-racism in my own skill set, before I could progress to what I felt like needed to be like level 100, given the time that happened. That wasn't true for Patrick, and that wasn't true for Nathan. They each had their own, like, I know Patrick leaned hard and continues to lead hard into his adoption identity. And then maybe secondarily, although at this point they're probably pretty break even, his like Asian Americanness. And for Nathan, that was different balance of those things too. Right. And I think, as I said at the top of the show, like disability didn't come into that equation until much later being like probably 8 months. I don't know. Sure. Through a friend of mine, I think, who reposted something from Disability Together. And I was like, oh yeah, I should think about that. Even though prior to my adoption apocalypse, the disability community was the one that I felt most closely associated with, probably second only to Asianness, in terms of like intrinsic physical identities that we hold about ourselves. So, I think it's hard to ask someone how they think about themselves in terms of like those distinct identities, because I typically, my experience has been that people aren't able to break themselves down into component pieces quite like that. For example, the other night, Sarah and I were having dessert, and she said, what type of bowl do you want your dessert in? It was like a cobbler. I was like, I don't know, just like this kind of like larger, like half plate, half bowl situation.
Sure.
And she was like, oh, well, I'm going to get this small little like rice bowl because I like it. I was like, oh, why do you like that more than the bowl that I chose? And she was like, I don't know, I just like it. I'm like, well, but like, what about it makes you happy? And she's like, well, it's cute. It had like a design painted on it, and it's small. And I feel like I get more of it because even though we had the same portions by weight, it was presented in a smaller package. So it felt like a whole bowl as opposed to mine being more spread out, whatever. And so like I was able to find out why she thought her bowl and her choice was better than mine. But like it took me 4 questions to get there, and so I was like, people don't typically think about themselves, whether because they're not given the space or they don't have someone about ideas, for a multitude of reasons. They don't think about themselves like that necessarily. And I've got a whole podcast where I get to explore those identities that way. So I think it is just like, it's tough to be able to think about those intersections. And I think too, it's down to person. Like there are a lot of adoptees for whom adoption is not a big part of their journey. Whether that's because like they had their apocalypse moment and it wasn't that big a deal, or it's just not like their pre-apocalypse moment. But it's just not one of those things. And so I think it's a matter of finding like what is the core identity of who you are, and then letting that be the thing that binds you together.
Yeah, the driving force.
Like, to me, like I almost feel more. Sometimes I feel more Asian than adopted, and other times I feel more adopted than Asian in terms of like identities.
100%.
But that's really, really fluid.
Yeah.
Like disability. Part of the reason I don't talk about it that much is like I don't feel it that much in terms of my own able-bodied privilege. Like I'm pretty able-bodied, so I don't have to wrestle with these things. They're not like at the forefront of my mind in the same way that it would be for other people.
Sure.
So
absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, because I think there's a lot of times where we try to compartmentalize, and people, I'm actually sometimes jealous of the people that can like really make these clear, distinct lines with their identity and all the intersections and cross community relationships, because sometimes, like you said, like I do feel a lot more Asian American at this point in time, or I feel more my adoptee kind of narrative and identity is definitely showing through now. And sometimes it's a culmination of all of it. It's just I just think because like, and you mentioned how, people, that's just naturally not what they do. They like what they like, or they have certain preferences, but being able to kind of start breaking those down and figuring out what are those motivating factors, I think, is kind of why the Janchi Show is incredible in that regard. And spaces just like the Janchi Show, where you get to explore these different intersections and identities. But also too, like what are the questions to ask? Not to get too like meta with it, right? But it's like, what are these questions that we're supposed to be asking about ourselves? And if we're unwilling or unable to kind of express and compartmentalize to others, like, here's what this identity has shown me and what I've learned from it and how I, engage with it. And this is what I do, versus, just having it be a giant unknown. So I guess, with myself, like, especially living in Koreatown, there's times where I'm like, oh yeah, very Korean right now, feeling very Asian American right now. And then all it takes sometimes is only like one interaction where they think I can speak Korean. I'm like, oh, and there's the adoptee side kind of punching through. And I just think about all the little ways, and maybe this is just me feeling self-conscious, all the little ways of people, like maybe not considering like a person's identity or a person's disability or a person's, multifaceted humanness of all of it, and thinking about how, like, we will say like, this is lame, or we will say silly, stupid stuff that may, trigger or may, upset others, or may show that you're not as in tune or not as, as well versed as a person that you think you are. And so, yeah, thank you for kind of exploring that with me in that regard. Cause, there's people out there. I met some of the presenters of the disability at Con, at the disability panel at Con. I had the privilege of getting to meet with a couple of them. We weren't able to discuss much, but it was so wonderful seeing them being able to speak on their own behalf in their own way. And not only that, we had those that we had ASL interpreters everywhere, and that was so refreshing. In many instances, I was actually looking at the interpreter while I was, just listening. I had the privilege of listening and being able to also, watch the interpreter. And I think just those little tiny bits of privilege or just kind of, once again, I think I don't want to be celebrating ableism, but like, it's like one of those things where being exposed to it more I've only gained more appreciation for it. And some people are like, well, duh, you idiot. But like, then there's times I think where people are happy living in their ignorance, living in their bliss, of not having to wrangle or wrestle or even just be simply exposed to any of these things, whether it's the disabled community or not, right? Maybe it's something else, but yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on like just maybe the overexposure or maybe not overexposure, the exposure of marginalized communities or communities in general to mass public, especially maybe even from an ability, like a physical ability kind of lens. Like if it's not necessary, like I can watch a TV show, no problem, but I prefer having the subtitles on and stuff like that. Like what would be the benefit, I guess, to having full accessibility and all the tools be presented just up front for everybody? Or is that too big of a question, I guess?
No, I don't think it's I mean, it is a big question, but I don't think it's like too big of a question. But I think it's just the idea of representation. Representation matters. Mm-hmm. And like representation in a way that doesn't other.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's one thing to go to a place and see an ASL interpreter. And I'm not saying this about you, but just be like, oh man, that's so cool. There's an ASL interpreter. Yeah. And that's like, that sticks out in your brain because you don't see it.
Oh, regularly, right?
Yeah. It sticks out in your brain because you're like, oh man, yeah. Seeing that interpreter, maybe there is someone who needs that because they can't hear what's going on. It's a live event and we don't have, our AI generated subtitles aren't good enough, or we don't have a platform where we can project those out there. So we have an ASL interpreter, which, side note, that's a weird thing that I've never thought about, but maybe maybe AI is coming for an ASL interpreter's jobs. I don't know.
No.
Anyways, but like when I talk about like the internet being accessible by default, right? Like I get annoyed when certain things, like when I have to do it on my own, like because I'm like, man, somebody's already built all this and I have to like go and redo it and whatever just to make it accessible and blah, blah, blah. And like, it like, you know, like selfishly, I'm like, oh man, I designed this thing and I checked my colors and there's not enough contrast and I have to go back and redesign it. So whatever, like I complain about my own privilege, right? Like the labor that I have to do to make it accessible. And yet if things are accessible by default, then it's like, we don't stop. Like it doesn't feel weird to see something like an ASL interpreter out in the wild. It doesn't, like, I remember being shamed by my friends for like watching things with subtitles on, you know, and be like, what you watch things with subtitles on? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Like I like it. It helps me, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, it's so weird, you know, whatever. And I'm like, it just makes it a safer space for people who do that, for that not to be like, it's just easier for them to be themselves, you know? Like I don't remember if I've talked about this on the show. When I worked at the church, a good friend of mine who was hired to be the facilities person was so excited about like being able to install paper towel dispensers that were manual instead of like the ones where you wave your hand in front of them. He was like, oh yeah, it's like saves us so much money, blah, 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 whatever. And I was like, it really bothered me at the time because we had worked together. We had been friends, whatever. And I was just like, do you not see that you work with a disabled person on staff? Like, are you so blind to this reality of my life that like you're literally this is obviously a minuscule example, but you go to greater lengths to make my life harder, you know, essentially those kinds of things. And like, but if things are accessible by default, like if homes have wider hallways so that they're easier to navigate with wheelchairs, like all those kinds of things. And like, again, it just continues to take away the emotional labor of those marginalized communities. And you're like, no, this is the way it is. And we actually care about those things. And then what I think we notice, and this is true of, what I've seen in like the Target and the Starbucks and all that stuff with all of like them like putting out like bright stuff and then it being like retracted or being vandalized or whatever. You see that, but it's like, it's the absence of those things that hurts those marginalized communities. Once they're out there and then you take them away, then it's like, that's even worse. Like, because it invalidates on a level that like you already had to struggle to like live basically. But once you're seen and then like they decide, you know what, this is too much or too hard or whatever, then it's like you just get slapped in the face and you're like, why are you gonna do that? You know? But I think it's a good thing overall to sit in discomfort.
Yes.
Erik, I've heard you say a number of times, you're like, I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm still kind of learning, you know, whatever. And I think that like an example for me is I sat in my own discomfort. my brain moved ahead of the other part of my brain, the deeper part of my brain, I guess. It used to make me so uncomfortable to see two men kissing on screen. I've been like totally okay with gay people in my life and whatever, just like the queer community, like for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And it would like still like the point at which it was uncomfortable for me to watch two men kiss on screen.
Yeah.
While I was also like mentally like advocating for like queer rights and, you know, like all that kind of stuff. It was so weird to me. I couldn't understand that discomfort, but it was like deep. I was like, do I just hate myself? Do I hate my manhood? And like gender expression is generally something that I'm currently wrestling with in terms of like my own identity.
Sure.
I'm like, I don't think it's that. So it's like, but I think those moments of discomfort when you see marginalized communities living their life, just being themselves,
Sure,
are opportunities for us then to question, like, why am I feeling like that? Like if there is something that like makes me be like, that gives me pause or whatever, like that discomfort, I think it's good to sit in because it makes you a more complex human. But B, that's an area where you're like, do I need to update my language? Do I need to like think about things differently? Do I need to just expose myself to those kinds of things? You know what I mean? And yeah, so I think that those are good spaces to be in and overall help you as an ally, as an advocate, as a person who's just trying to be better, a little bit better each day. Like sitting in that discomfort is really helpful for cluing you into where's that next 1% better going to come from.
Yeah. And I'm not quite sure if it's going to be like a statistical or quantifiable measurement of like how I'm getting better or how I'm trying to advance language. But to your point, like I too kind of suffered from that. Like, ew, why are they, like, why am I getting such a revolting feeling seeing two men kiss on screen? Like, why? What? Like, let's break this down, And for some, they're just like, well, I don't like it. And then they write it off and they're doing their own thing. Whereas like, I guess, yeah, for me and for the people that I want to keep close to me, it's just like, okay, let's just break this down a little bit. And I think that's a personal journey for many. It's like trying to figure these things out. Whereas like, I felt like if we had, and I think and feel that if we had more exposure to these types of things, right, and it's more like readily available to the public, then we wouldn't be in situations of, I don't know, like we wouldn't. Maybe that's too idealistic. I'm thinking like, oh well, if we just had more exposure, like it'd solve all our problems. But it doesn't. It's like people still have to put in that work, and it's just like, how can we? Because not everybody has friends like you, KJ. Not everybody has friends like in queer spaces or adopted spaces or in marginalized communities. How can we reach them? And that's been something that I've been wrestling around a lot with too. Cause like, I think, part of the adoptee conference, there was a white domestic adoptee, and this conference is typically for Korean adoptees and Asian adoptees, or historically has been. But, I just got to thinking like, I get that, just the exposure of it. It's like, oh yeah, you got to remember like the adoptee experience is not just transracial intercountry. It's also domestic, it's also late discovery. It's all these different things. And so kind of being exposed to that is one thing, but being able to do the work, right, and investigate it and have, people to talk to and safe spaces in accordance with that. It's like, where do we start? Because oftentimes it just feels like I've been exposed to it. Now what? Like, what's the direction now? Where do I go? I think it's one thing to be, and I also think it's one thing to be an ally, like you were saying, like I believe, like in supporting my my queer community and my brothers and sisters, or however you identify. See that I'm still working on that kind of language, right? How do I support them? And then, but also like why am I still feeling this way? Like as just like a jerk, like a knee jerk reaction, and I don't know.
Yeah, I think maybe we can wrap up here,
Sure.
But I think like the discomfort is good because it clues you in on where you can do the work.
Absolutely.
Right. So then you go and you do the work. and like mentally you're there and your gut is still not there.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's two things to remember for me, because I just lost one of them. But two things to remember. One of them is comfort takes time. And so like it is the regular exposure to that thing. It's the regular willingness to do the work, and it just takes time. But I think like in the case of, for me, watching two men kiss, and this doesn't happen, like no other part of the queer community, like have I had such a visceral like gut reaction to.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally just two male presenting bodies kissing that like really bothered me. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what it was. But I think ultimately what changed was I was like, these are two people just wanting to live their life. Two fictional people on a TV show.
Yeah, true. That too.
Wanting to live their life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I just had to like be okay with that.
Yeah.
I had to figure like if I love
Mm-hmm.
and just like want love to be the thing.
Yeah.
I'm like, I just gotta make that okay. And then I think when I like after I had done all this work around these like parts of identity that make up the human person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in spaces like the show or at a conference like you went to, it can be really easy to be like, ooh, identity, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
But I was actually after I'd done all of this identity work and I came back to seeing couples, male presenting couples on TV as human beings, characters in a story, but human beings as people again.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was like, oh, of course I can celebrate this because these are two people who have found love. These are two people who are celebrating that. And I don't want to get in the way of any of that, you know? And I think that like that's such a like a almost it feels like something somebody on the right would say, right? It feels like an all lives matter, or it feels I don't see race, right? But actually it's like it is the necessary full circleness of it, where you go and you do all this work to see race, to see gender, to see sexuality, to see ability, to see like all of these things. And then through that, see the fullness of the human being and root for the humans and be like, I just want you to be so happy and so full of joy and whatever, you know? And I remember too, like, at one of the like the event for my wife's work, the event, like the gala, there was a Wish kid who was dancing. She was doing the cha-cha slide. She had this killer dress on and she was in a wheelchair. And I was like, she's going so hard. She's doing the most work on this dance floor.
I love it.
I mean, it was pure joy watching her dance. Right. And I was like, I see her in her wheelchair and like can register that that's like extra difficult for her. But actually at the end of the day, like I just saw her as a teenager having fun with other teenagers, like with an affinity group. But I was like, man, this is just like, that's the joy that I think is so important.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think just remembering that comfort takes time is really important. And I don't remember what the second thing is.
That's okay.
I think but yeah, just doing the work. But then, you know, and I think that there's always like, if you're still uncomfortable, then there's still more work to be done.
Yeah.
And it might not be in the place that you expect. Right. Yeah. But I think like sometimes you just have to give yourself time. But I think what I found was ultimately I just had to come back to like, after I had done all of this identity work in myself and use those skills to give that benefit to others, like try to like do the emotional labor, whatever. As I was like, all of this means nothing if I don't come back to seeing people as people.
Yep.
You know, all of this means nothing if I'm not able to move through that, not just like ignore it, but move through it to get back to the humanity of people.
Yeah.
And then I can really, really celebrate and really advocate for that.
I think that's such a great bow tie on all of it, is that it's the humanity of it, right? Is that, where I kind of started to feel comfortable, right, in seeing those spaces. I had a roommate who's gay in Utah, of all places, and I remember seeing him just break down after a breakup, right? It was a bad breakup, and I was like, oh, he reacted just like I did. And it was just kind of like, it was one of those things where it's like, whether he reacted in the same way I have in the past about a breakup, it doesn't matter. It's like, once again, just feeling the emotion and seeing that was just like, yeah, we're all human. He just broke up with somebody that was very close to them. And it's like, being able to share those experiences, those emotions, like, yeah, it's a crappy emotion to have, but at the same time, it's like knowing that you have that shared reaction. It's like, doesn't that bring us together as people? And whether that person was another man or another, or whoever, right? It didn't matter. What mattered was like, we have those shared experiences, and we can't forget the humanity of it. So, yeah, I got some tools and I got some direction. And hopefully this was also something that you found cathartic or something that was constructive. Because I know for myself, I've been able to kind of sit in my discomfort a little bit more. And also, yeah, remind myself and give myself grace of like, dude, you're a human. You'll have mistakes. You'll have mistakes along the way. But so long as I think you're putting forth a positive effort because I think there's a lot of people out there like myself where it's like, I have all these questions, but don't know where to start. And I think, having that comfortability, like you said, takes time. It takes work. And then hopefully you come full circle with it and remind yourself of the humanity that is also there at the end of the day, that we do have shared experiences, that we do have, these things that are innately human, humanness. I don't know, like innately human, that we all share, regardless of any kind of other circumstance or identity.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for reaching out, and it was a real privilege to talk to you about this because it revealed some of my own blind spots, some other ways to give myself grace.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that was important, and it just also reminded me like, part of being comfortable. I guess my like other piece of advice is like, just be comfortable with being wrong. And be comfortable with like backing down.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like, especially like the newer comedies that I see, have like this white woman who tries to do her like new diversity training, gets it wrong, and then just doesn't back down.
Yeah.
And like doesn't say like, I'm sorry, whatever. But like, it's uncomfortable to sit in like, oh, I've just said something that maybe was not as inclusive as I wanted to be, or I expressed something that like, whatever, I got it wrong.
Yep.
Yeah. And be like, I'm so sorry. And then just like immediately have to back down from that and just sit in that own discomfort, but not let that detract you. But yeah, and I think that it was just, there's been a really fun conversation. And I hope that it's a safe space for a lot of people to enter into. I'm sure we got things wrong in the midst of talking. And I'm happy to hear about it. And I hope that people, practice sitting in discomfort, and that this becomes the beginning of a way to be like, oh yeah, maybe I feel ready to tackle this point of intersectionality of what it means to be human and what it means to give grace to other humans and those kinds of things. So yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was my conversation with Erik Kemp. Thank you, Erik, for hosting and for being willing to provide a platform and be vulnerable as we explore some new areas and try out some new language and ultimately just get curious and try to be better humans. If you want to reach out to me or to the show, you can find us at Janchi Show on all of our social media platforms. You can send us an email to janchishow@gmail.com. You can leave us a voicemail if you have a follow-up question or anything like that to 972-677-8867. I'm at KJ Relke, wherever I want to be found on the internet. Patrick is at Patrick in the World. Nathan is at nnowak. You can also find Nathan on Facebook. If you want to support the show, please leave a rating or review. Tell your friends, spread the news that there's a good new podcast that you've enjoyed listening to. I think that is it. Let's see. Oh, other accounts, Disability Together and Kelsey Lindell, are both linked in the show notes. You can find Erik Kemp at KempBop on Instagram. And yeah, I think that's it. So until next time, Janchi Heyo!